Tim's been a great friend to Mayo Clinic. We've actually worked on 3 startup companies together. He's supported 3 of our early stage startup investments, and more recently he's actually stepped up his commitment to Mayo Clinic. He's made a commitment to having an office here at the Accelerator, really to promote entrepreneurship and to support entrepreneurship, not only at Mayo, but also the entire city of Rochester, so we're very thankful for that. Also, more recently, Tim just raised a venture fund. He closed it earlier this year. He's actually carved out a little piece of that fund to dedicate to funding early stage companies here in Rochester, most notably some of the Mayo technologies that we spin out. So we're very thankful and looking very forward to that. A little additional information on Tim. Prior to his time at Sanderling, he also worked at a company called Target Therapeutics, where he was Chief Scientific Officer, and actually helped engineer the sale of that company to Boston Scientific for $1.3 billion. And that was back in 1997, so that tells you the size of that deal. That was the largest device transaction up until 1997, so a tremendous deal for Tim. He also has a tremendous background in academics. He has a PhD from Berkeley in bioengineering, as well as 2 master's degrees from Berkeley in computer sciences and also electrical engineering. So a great background and a great support to Mayo Clinic. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Tim.
Well, thank you, Jeff. Before we get started here, we have some chairs down front here, and I promise there's no pop quiz presentation, so it's not a problem for me to come down and sit. It's always tough to follow a pizza in beer, because you never quite know why people showed up, either for pizza and beer or, once it's done, everybody leaves. But it's great to see all the faces in the Accelerator today. I can remember not that long ago when we sort of talked about this facility and this sort of kickoff day, and really not only myself, but Sanderling and all my partners were just honored to be able to be part of this. As Jeff had said, we have been partners for a long time, and I think that the history together has been very rewarding, and we're optimistic that we can make the future even brighter than the past. And so with your help and the entrepreneurs across the country that we work with to source deals and to employ in our new companies, I think the sky's the limit. I think this is a unique time for life science investing, and certainly a unique time for life science as an enterprise. And so it's really an honor for me to be able to talk to all of you today. And hopefully what I have to say, will resonate with some of you, and hopefully it will inspire you to do things maybe a little different, but hopefully the end result will be success, and we'll be able to build together new armamentariums to treat human disease. And certainly that's why I do what I do, and I'm sure many of you here have the same ideas and the same ideals for the future. So without any more rambling, just so you know, I have my dutiful assistant here, Nathan, his hand up and waving. So Nathan was kind enough to help with the cabling and setting up on the computer, and we realized it wasn't going to work for me because I would get tangled in the cord. And so when I constantly be pointing at that room, I didn't want you guys to think I was trying to do, hand animals. It was an old projector, but Nathan's kind of, So without any further ado, the title of my talk tonight, really came from a little bit of sort of thinking back on what is really different now, to try to contemporize this talk and to be able to hopefully have a bit of a dialogue with all of you, either not tonight, but in the future, and give you something to think about. It's really, what do we think is different now? What is it that are the driving forces that we think all entrepreneurs should be thinking about? And I get asked the question time and time again, sort of where are the areas that you think are interesting? And my real answer to that is anything that's going to be successful. And no one likes that answer. So I decided not to talk about that. And so, if you So tonight, this is the premise of the talk, is to understand your exits. As an entrepreneur, there was clearly a time when this never came up. This question never came up. The question was, is this idea that we have, is this opportunity to invest, does it provide a big enough market opportunity? That used to always be the question. And our answer would be, well, let's see, the available market, we'd like you to believe that you can convince us that it's at least $500 million or more, because we know you're never going to get there. So when it gets chopped down to some reasonable size, there's still enough there to interest someone to take the company out. And that is still a reasonable question, but sort of in the wrong order. The real question is what you're thinking about. How do you get to an exit? And so tonight we're going to talk a little bit about that. So if this is just to give some color to that sort of general question. So if you look between 2000 and say 2010, the VC-backed private companies, both M&A and IPO, and I'm going to use those interchangeable here. So this exit concept that I talk about tonight, there are other exits besides M&A and IPO. You can say, well, I plan never to exit. I plan to build a company that's profitable and continue to be a wholly owned company, and that's great too. But from an exit portfolio here, we're limit ourselves to two thoughts here tonight, at least for M&A and IPO. And this gives kind of almost, for me, is sort of a sobering map. I don't know if you can see the small print, but this says cardiology and vascular. The next biggest one is orthopedics, hospital supplies, diagnostics, imaging, dental, radiation oncology, all the way down to, I think that says hearing is 1%, home care. And so what this sort of says to me is that the classical areas in medicine were the areas that we were chasing over the past 10 years. And whether or not that will be the areas of the next decade, I think is still very much in question. And so I put this up more as a historical perspective, because moving forward, I think that, at least from our perspective, we're looking for opportunities that help answer the questions about medicine in the future, as well as being able to provide the necessary markets and be clearly addressing the unmet clinical needs in medical cleaning. Now, the other concern that many folks have when they come to talk to us is they think of us as a venture capitalist that works in the life science industry, and more importantly, they think that probably all we're interested in, because they've heard this from other people, is that we want to invest in late stage opportunities, investing in that last round to have the highest IRR and hopefully a reasonable multiple. But I can tell you that I use this slide as an example that sort of is a contrarian view of that. Sanderling Ventures has always been an early stage investment, and so we pride ourselves in our ability to find technologies and invest early. And we believe that that really does, as the slide projects here, provide as an investor the most flexibility. I picked these sort of three companies here as examples of acquisitions that were done early. And these are, I think I picked three med tech companies. These were all done early. And we are big believers in the early investment stage. And we not only believe that, but you'll see if you go on our website and you sort of look at the activities that we've been involved in, that we've started almost every one, or have been the first investors in almost every one of our companies. And what it provides for is exactly what is depicted here on the screen. Is it provides for the ability to get into the pipeline of an acquirer early on. It provides the ability to get that early exit if the technology works well. And like the situation with CardioMEMS, it provides you with an opportunity to do an early deal that, albeit I don't think that St. Jude has actually pulled the last trigger on it, but they're close to it based on what is expected to happen with the FDA. But that's a very powerful leverage, very powerful leverage that you have as an investor if you can do these early stage deals. And again, one of the reasons why I put these on the screen was because it sort of relates back to that first question, is understand your exits. And so an exit can be a multi-staged exit. An exit can be bringing an acquirer, a potential acquirer on board as a partner. It doesn't have to be a lock, stock, and barrel that things happen all at once. In fact, some companies, in sort of jumping to a little different space, but Alexion Pharmaceuticals was a company that benefited from a big partnership in an area where their drug candidates didn't work out, but the partner spent tens of millions of dollars and helped them really refine and develop their company, and then they were able to take albeit classes of drugs that didn't work for the partner's needs and actually create, in their case, orphan disease applications for those. And so there's lots of different ways to get to that end, and the theme here is to try to understand what your end game will be to be able to help you plot your course from an early position. So, one of the themes that we had in raising Sanderling 7, our most recent fund, was the question that limited partners asked us. They said, well, okay, we understand that you're somewhat agnostic from where you get involved in your companies, but you're a proponent of early stage activities. And clearly you're not going to do an IPO necessarily on an early stage asset. So if that's the case, then why were we so bullish that big pharma and med tech would really be interested, or as the slide asks the question here, why would they have to play? And so there's an interesting sort of overlap, I would say, between the needs of the larger companies and their profile. And if you think about the drug companies in general, both biotech and pharmaceuticals, they have a very interesting, and I'm sure it wasn't by design, but a very interesting and precipitous patent cliff that many of their products that are currently being marketed are experiencing. And they're actually experiencing that right now. And that is, as you can imagine, that has fueled both the generics business, but it has also brought to mind with them early on the need for them not to have gaps in their product pipeline portfolio. And we'll touch on that in a minute. The sort of the marketing or overcrowding of drugs that are available, really looking for unique opportunities, sort of standout technologies that they can, albeit early on in their development, they can reach out and pick and bring them into their pipeline. And then the other piece is that their internal developments, whether you think of this as classical R&D development, monies or capital to support that, have really been shifted in their pipeline of development more into their clinical work. And so with all of those overlaps going on, the private company sector, or at least the venture sector, who's developing products is really, if you think of it, a replacement for their internal R&D development. There's another component that sort of happens within big organizations, and this cartoon sort of tries to speak to that. And I'll read the caption for you guys in the back. It says, so you obviously have the big boss here, probably the head of R&D, and one of his best scientists walks in. And just imagine, this is a big company. There's 60,000 people that work there. And R&D is such a big organization that they don't, not everybody in the organization really knows each other. And so he walks into his boss and he says, I'll be happy to give you innovative thinking. What are the guidelines? And so it's not meant to make fun of big organizations, because big organizations do things very, very well. Some of the best clinical trials, some of the best clinical and regulatory work is really a part of these immensely successful companies. But this cartoon kind of points out something that culture does not motivate people to do. It does not motivate them to think out of the box. It does not motivate them to think outside the guidelines of the organization provided, because in fact it is their ability to stay within those guidelines that has allowed this scientist to be part of this 100,000 person organization. So that's sort of the inventor's dilemma, and that is really why Silicon Valley exists, because Silicon Valley is a collection of a lot of companies that were, in a sense, rogue in their thinking. They provided new ways to do things, and certainly the guidelines of organizations like that are very blurry. So in this theme of sort of big pharma buyers, this is an example here in sort of the change in their product revenues by 2015. And this is really, you can see reimbursement pressures, patent expiry, FDA scrutiny have all led to decrease in revenues. And so these are sort of estimates to what that's going to drive. But the primary reason here is that new pipeline products are necessary to keep, in effect, to overcome these relatively large negative red numbers on the right. And then to try to balance this, this slide really speaks to the med tech companies having increasing revenues but slowing growth, again for the same reason. Look to strategic M&A as a fast to market and really their lowest risk alternative. If you think of it, if you're in a business where you are producing a world-class therapy in one particular area, it is hard to create new pathways for your R&D, because most of that work is really being done to support the products that you currently have and have to market. And that forces most companies to think sort of incrementally. In some ways, we're seeing that with probably the most innovative company, or one of the most innovative companies right now is Apple, where you think about how Apple went from sort of a conventional platform where they were trying to make a computer, albeit on a different operating system, but a computer that had a touch and a feel similar to that of the DOS-based machines. But there was an evolution in their thinking when they, in a sense, abandoned that notion and decided to build the iPhone, the iPad, and that. And that was a revolutionary step that occurred, for a number of reasons. But if you now look at their product development and their new product launches, you would argue that, when is really the next innovation? They're very clever at marketing sort of new incrementalism, but they've yet to come up with that next step. And not that they're not trying, but it's very difficult to do. And so we see the same sorts of limitations in this sort of list of really world-class, big, successful device companies, and project that this will continue to be a right place to sell into as well. So the next slide is sort of where are they playing? Because the premise of this discussion here is to really understand your exits. Well, one of the things that you want to make sure is that the exit strategy that you have is consistent where your exit opportunities may be. And clearly, if you're going to go the path of an IPO, you can be a little more unique and rogue in your thinking. But if you're going to sell into an organization, you want to at least understand the boundaries of that organization. And so this to me is more of a broad-based roadmap. And this looks theoretically out to 2030. and it's from the World Health Organization, and these are projected mortality by cause. And so the reason why we look at a roadmap like this is because, in theory, there's really no way to know necessarily how a group like Medtronic really is going to project and set their sail for the next 15 years. You can say that they will follow a similar path to what they did the previous 15 years, but that's complete speculation. You can say that you could turn the clock back when St. Jude was just a valve manufacturer, and you could have convinced yourself that they would never do anything other than valves, but clearly they've been very wise in their evolution. And so instead of looking at individual companies, what we do is we use more data like this, and we try to tease out from data like this trends. And this is in theory a trend that, and again, I apologize for the small writing, but this sort of orangish is digestive disorders, respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases, neuropsychiatric disorders, diabetes complications, and malignant neoplasm, so all malignancies. But it gives you somewhat of a roadmap that says this is the way the population is likely to respond to this. And so clearly, when you think about your exits in areas like these, the likelihood of having growth, the likelihood of lining up with truly unmet clinical needs is reasonable. And we think it's actually better to sort of plot your course based on data like this as opposed to trying to just purely from conjecture try to guess where interest will be in the future. And the title here, MedTech Growth Areas Aligned with Mortality Projections, I've used this as an example to kind of show you how, if you think of, in a sense, all of these companies, Boston Scientific, got started by John Abley, who had an idea on how to use balloon angioplasty in peripheral arteries. At the time, that was sort of not a lost art, but most people were kind of running after coronary angioplasty. But Mr. Abley felt that was a better entry point, and for a number of reasons. Medtronic, clearly, all of you in the room know their history there with their pacing business, and St. Jude, as we had talked about, got started as a valve company. But what's interesting here, at least for me, when I look at how their companies have evolved, how they've evolved to not only depict what those true disease disorders are, but also how they have become very much alike each other. And that's why these Venn diagrams, sort of the ultimate overlap, showing that in fact 3 companies that came from pretty different areas have sort of all migrated together, and more and more they look very similar. And so kind of what this teaches to us is that this is, as the companies grow, even in the medtech space, they become more and more competitive with one another. The need to grow, the need to take on new products is really fueled by the fact that now that they are a successful big company, the expectation that investors have, requires double-digit growth, or they fall into other considerations that are not that great for their outcomes. And so we continue to see this evolution. We like the device space in situations where the drug companies have not been able to adequately treat disease using drug technologies, or where drug technologies that are being marketed are really not treating the underlying disease. And so this is just really another shot at, this is an older slide taken from 2010 that tried to hierarchically rank these companies. And you can see already that sort of the stent business has flipped a bit. Johnson & Johnson really, I wouldn't say abandoning the stent business, but this kind of ranking we typically do every year or so, to really understand who and what technologies have been able to be applied here. Now, Abbott is an interesting story. If you think about what's going on in their cardiovascular area, they really, I think, were the beneficiary of Boston Scientific's acquisition of Guidance, because they got some stent technology out of that as a divestiture that was necessary for Boston to get the deal done. And I think they've done one step better. They are now have introduced a bioresorbable stent, and the bioresorbable stent may allow them to really, for the first time, expand the rules under which stenting can be done, and even more important for patients, it may, for the first time, allow stenting of some of the most vulnerable lesions that we see, the lipid-rich plaques, the vulnerable plaques that usually occur in areas where the coronary artery is not critically stenosed, but in fact is relatively wide open, but it's very dangerous. And so we try to map, again, these kind of technology shifts to see who is winning, who is losing as part of our roadmap to know what to be investing with, and also who to target early on as either partners or potential acquirers in the end. So, you know, as part of all of this, where is technology heading, is certainly a big part of making any sound decision on when you jump in and become a new CEO or go to work for a new startup. And I can tell you that this is probably the toughest question that we have from time to time. Because, you know, as this little picture shows, it's not just the need to do something, right? I mean, in this case, this is a scary reminder that, you know, neurosurgeons had a need to open the skull a long time ago, and they did their best to put together the technologies they need. But when you look at this, I mean, it makes me shiver to think that they actually ever used that on someone. And so, you know, technology for the sake of technology is never really the answer. The real question is, can you deduce this multiple overlapping mosaic that you're putting together before you start your company? Can you deduce, can you convince yourself and others that your technology is really meaningful? Not technology for technology's sake, but meaningful. Is it unique? And at the end of the day, will it provide an opportunity to build a company around that can have an exit that's defined, or at least can be defined enough to convince people to come to work for the company and for investors to invest? So, you know, again, this is one of these kind of interesting slides, because this is from a marketing agency that does this kind of work, and I always enjoy kind of looking at these and then kind of tracking over time. You know, what is their batting average? And so while we don't completely discount these completely, we put, I would say, a heavy discount factor on it. But it is interesting to look at how people sort of come to the same resolution, right? How they come to the same point. Because the same people that are doing this are looking at much of this same data that we've seen here. They're looking at sort of the epidemiology data of certain diseases. They're looking at what they project forward and what they think population base and density will cause for diseases they know, and they hypothesize or create models to try to be predictive on sort of new diseases and how that might manifest itself. But, you know, I think that if you look at the top here, we have sort of diagnostic imaging, nuclear imaging, interventional radiology, and capsule endoscopy. Now, you know, that feels to me like somebody who was an investor in some of these early technologies and really was able to influence that. I think, you know, drug delivery, when they talk about needle-free injections, transdermal systems, inhalation, and infusion, well, I mean, it was like they opened up a dictionary and just kind of wrote those down. And so, not to make fun of this, but I think for us as investors, we never really follow this like this. We follow somewhat of an intuitive feel of where we think medicine is struggling, where we think medicine is excelling, and try to find that space in between there where we can provide capital and know-how to opportunities that we believe will really turn the page on any particular sort of shortcoming that's currently being struggled with. The other piece that we try to do is once we find a technology that we think that we really do understand, once we find a technology that we think that suspend our disbelief and get to a point where we believe that we can be successful if the technology does what it says, then we put the company's operations in another sort of do loop of diligence. And what this tries to tease out is that this whole diligence phase is something that is a living phase that has to stay with the company. While we may do this in our diligence before we make an investment, the business plan has to consider these, at least these 5 different components on an ongoing basis, and to constantly be doing this more of in a parallel processing way as opposed to a sort of sequential way. And what I mean by that is, it wasn't that long ago where if you believed you had a technology that had a good legal and IP position, meaning it was unique, you suspended your disbelief and you said, if that technology and the IP can do what we say it does, then clearly, and you could identify that there was a clear market advantage, that there was a potential of that company getting funded. And if it got funded, then the first thing that we really looked into was how are we going to build an R&D organization? And our organizations are usually fairly small when companies are first founded, anywhere between 3 and 10 people. And we used to think of just that R&D picture. If the R&D picture was successful, then we allowed ourselves to look off into the clinical piece. If the clinical piece was successful, then and so on. And we would build the company and we would finance the company incrementally in that way. And that was really possible because you could finance the company in that way. That if you did a good job here, if an entrepreneur showed up and they did a good job there, that they could get financed, and if you could get it to the R&D phase, you could, and if things went well, you could get it financed again and probably at a higher valuation than you did initially, and so on and so on and so on. And you really only hired a marketing person, after all of this was done, and you did some sort of round of financing that was maybe the valuation was maybe 3 times here what it was back there, because it was a logical process, and to some degree, because capital was a commodity. Well, I can tell you now, capital is not a commodity. And capital is one of the most scarce pieces of this whole equation. And so that is why we do this loop before we make the investment. And we encourage our companies to think about having to have expertise. And it doesn't necessarily have to be full-time expertise, but expertise that's a part of not only the business plan that runs this do loop, but also as the company is moving along, because there will be things that each of the companies learns that it needs to alter its course slightly. But in doing so, all of these considerations need to be actively reviewed. Even when you're in this phase, you need to know how you're going to approach marketing, because if you didn't already know how you were going to do it, you would have never started and made the investment. And so this slide, to me, in addition to the first slide, which I really think is one of the most important messages that this talk attempts to discuss and throw out for discussion. This is also equally important in that the ability to run your company in a way that you can constantly understand all of these moving parts. And in fact, the way that you plan on marketing it eventually may be different than the way that you imagined marketing it when you did your diligence. But the fact that you have the expertise, and that expertise can be achieved through outside resources, it can be achieved through a potential partner, it can be achieved by hiring those people in the organization. But to understand all these, and that's why it's drawn as a wheel, all these pieces of the wheel, we think are necessary in today's environment to be successful. And then this is really an overused term, but I think it resonates for me with sort of the first question that we asked is the companies are bought, not sold. And if you think about it, that is a guiding influence in the way that you do things. Even an IPO, while it's, let's say, more predictable because you as an organization can chart a course to file an S1, to work with an investment banker, to go on a roadshow, and that kind of feels like you're controlling it. But at the end of the day, even in an IPO, it requires you to be able to get people to buy in, basically the underwriter to be able to set a price and buy your stock in the IPO. And so this to me is a piece that sort of goes back to the first question, but is oftentimes overlooked when in the past, when we've started companies. We had that mentality that if we build it, they will come. And we just don't advise that at this point in time with the economy and the capital markets the way they are. But there certainly is a huge need. I think there's more of a need now to create what we talk about here in number 6 is a win-win for all parties involved. There is no doubt, and all of you here, because of your close alliance with the Mayo Clinic, you can see the evolution of medicine. You can see the need for medicine now to evolve greater than it's ever evolved in the past, I think, in the short term. Combined with the fact that we are wiser now. We're wiser now about human biology than we've ever been. And in the past 15 years, the understanding of human biology has really jumped exponentially. And I think that that's true in almost every subspecialty. And so the opportunities to do the kinds of companies that we want to do to really be the cornerstones of the medicines of the future, be the cornerstones of the way we're going to treat people, be the cornerstones of the way we're going to impact human disease worldwide, I think is greater now than it's ever been. And so this is more of a checklist that we sort of think about in our minds as we walk through these different opportunities. And then, this is sort of my conclusion slide, in that life science M&A and IPO, if done right, has a tremendous potential for not only wealth generation, but product generation. The companies that we are starting today will undoubtedly be the pipeline drugs for the GlaxoSmithKlines, the Mercks, the Genentechs. The devices that we start today will undoubtedly be the future treatments for Medtronic, Boston Scientific, and a host of mid-sized companies that are going to grow up into that area. And so we think that, again, sort of the last little point here, that sound diligence practices, and that really for us means ask all these questions up front. Don't assume that the most important part of you starting your company is getting it started. Ask all these questions up front so that once you get the company started, you have more of a living framework that you will modify over time, but there will be fewer and fewer questions that you won't be able to answer as you move on. And so that sort of ends, my prepared remarks on the talk. And I just have one slide that I wanted to share with you about what we are doing at Sanderling to kind of help entrepreneurs make this what some people might bristle at and say, wow, it already was hard enough to do a startup, and now you're asking me to be predictive on all these other things. It's hard enough to get my patents put together and to get something filed and to have just enough data from the laboratory to bring to you to get funding, because how can you ask me to do all this and hold out funding until I've got this whole model created? So we understand that, and look, we understand the changing dynamic here. So this slide is really to give you a snapshot of a little bit of the way we work. So this is representative of what we call our evolutionary tools for Fund 7. So Sanderling, we've now raised 7 funds, and in the lifetime of Sanderling, we've raised over $1 billion of funds, and we've started probably over 70 companies. But each time that we do a fund, we try to build some what we call evolutionary tools, but really what they are, they're sort of proprietary tools that we believe that will help us make better decisions and help our entrepreneurs make better portfolio companies. And so in Sanderling 7, I put these 3 evolutionary tools that I thought were worth talking about. Sanderling's history is one of where we get involved with our companies. It's not unusual for one of the managing directors to be the interim CEO of the company. It's not unusual for our back office to function as the CFO. And it's not unusual for our internal counsel to help with employment agreements and HR issues. And the reason why we do that is not because we don't have other things to do. We do it because we think that the companies benefit from it, and they can exist on less money. Because if you think about it, when you first start your company, that is likely to be the highest cost of capital that you ever raise, is in that first round. It's when you have had to give up the most percentage of the company to get the least amount of dollars, or per dollar. And we don't believe in overfunding companies in the early stage. We believe it should be a very disciplined approach and get as much done as you can for the least amount of money. And so that really led us to this interesting relationship that we have with GSK. We have been approached by about a half a dozen either pharma companies or biotech companies, and now they're all looking very similar, because what used to be pharma companies, and when I say pharma, I mean small molecule based companies, and then biotech companies you can think of as sort of protein drug companies. But now they all, even the small molecule companies have protein drug development in them, and vice versa. And so we were approached by a handful of drug developers that wanted to be had come to us as potential strategic investors in their Sanderling 7 fund. And all but 2 of them were sort of excluded right off the bat because they had other ideas of what they considered a fair market. We're very strong believers in, once we develop a company, it needs to be able to stand on its own 2 feet. It needs to be able to, if it's good enough, achieve the best free market valuation that it can have. And you can imagine some strategic interests from the drug developers tend to limit that. And so of the 6 that were active talking to us, 4 were excluded because of that reason. Then we're down to 2 groups, and GSK was one of those groups. And they were both very impressive groups, big drug developers that would have been an honor to have either one of them working with us. But what we wanted was really more than that. We wanted to be able to have unique tools. We wanted them to provide tools for our entrepreneurs, for our portfolio companies. And only GSK was willing to do that. And so the GSK relationship allows us to go into, as an example, their world-class manufacturing facilities, to their toxicology, and any other what I would call preclinical and clinical assets, and be able to use those and make them available to our portfolio. And for us, that was a huge advantage. And it was something that, without a relationship with them for those assets, we as a company would have to fund those. We would have to fund drug manufacturing. We have to fund some of the toxicology, and even more importantly, some of the toxicology animal studies, which is a classical one, are not as predictive as we would like them to be for human work. And a group like GSK showed us a whole host of proprietary tests that they have that are based on some human cellular assays that have excellent predictive values, as you can imagine, much better than putting it in monkeys or rats or dogs. And so we think this will be a very attractive way for many of our companies to be able to do things more quickly and for less money early on. And then, certainly the relationship with Mayo, as Jeff had said, has been one that we've really been honored to be part of. And over the years, we just evolved together. I think we found that we were like-minded on a lot of considerations. We had a history of working together, and that was very positive. And so the ability to do a more formal program and be involved with the three centers here in Rochester, in Arizona, and in Florida, to be part of the accelerator and really look to use the tools from Mayo to not only find great opportunities to work on, but also to use the tools that may also include clinical trials and other preclinical work that goes on here, not only cell but other therapies. And we think that these sort of unique relationships, again, the whole idea is to be able to do things faster and cheaper in that sort of critical loop that sometimes you need to turn the crank a couple times on. If all of our companies went through one pass of preclinical, went into human, and went on to be successful, wouldn't be an issue. But almost none of them do that, right? They start, they go through preclinical, you get into phase 1, and you go, whoops, okay, that doesn't look like what I thought it was going to look like. You learn from that, and you come back and you turn the crank again. So this preclinical phase, if we can reduce the time and the expense of that, we think we're going to be way ahead. And we believe that the Mayo opportunity will not only help that, but will also help us source better and greater ideas. And the third tool here that's unique to Sanderling 7 is really a development company that we've put together in Montreal. The Montreal area was a favorite of ours because we had a unique investment up there that went very successfully, and it was sold to a bigger player. And we had a group of employees that had a unique skill set, and combined with the fact that the Canadian government makes it very business friendly, we have put together what you can think of as almost like a captive CRO. And so our ability to take ideas, both drug and device, and go up there and do work at what we think is going to be a considerable discount, and then either do additional work in Canada or take it to where it needs to go. We're very excited with it. And so the Therilia piece really fits into the ongoing effort to be able to do things faster with less expense for our portfolio companies. And so I'm gonna finish with that and thank all of you for sitting through the presentation today, and I hope to talk to as many of you as I can over the years, and hopefully we'll work together and find some great opportunities to roll out to help this whole armamentarium that needs constant need of growth to help cure human disease. Thank you all.
So for the Q&A, we're going to change things up a little bit. We're going to actually showcase a couple of our leading entrepreneurs here in the accelerator. Dr. Richard Eamon, who's the CEO of Resounded, and then Dr. Jeremy Fries, who's the CEO of Evidentially, which is right in the back corner. So if you guys could come forward, I asked if they could just provide a short 2 or 3 minute overview on their company and what they're working on, just to expose their companies to the community.
And then they may have a few questions directly for Tim, and then we'll open it up to the broad audience for questions for either Dr. Mills or the rest of the panel members. So, Dr. Newman, would you like to start?
Okay, well, thanks, Jeff. 3 minutes, that's a challenge, and I'll stick to it. But I'd like to start by acknowledging Troy Ziegler, who's here, who's the COO, Rashid Fendi, who's a finance person with the company, and the people from Sanderling Ventures who made all this happen, and then Jeff Torborg himself, who helped us tremendously with the business plan. So, Jeff also told me I couldn't show slides, which of course for a radiologist is terrible. So I put a poster. So anyway, I just Resounded is a company that Mayo Clinic company started just 9 months ago. But it did have a period of incubation within Mayo beforehand. Resounded is devoted to commercializing a new imaging technology called magnetic resonance elastography. And the first application of this technology, which was invented at Mayo, by the way, and the first application of this is for diagnosing an important condition called liver fibrosis. This is a disease that you can't detect with ordinary imaging technologies because it doesn't change the anatomy. And so patients who have needed to have this diagnosis made, and it's a common disease actually worldwide, in the past had to have biopsies, invasive procedure with a risk, not very pleasant, very expensive. Magnetic resonance elastography, the first application of it is for diagnosing this condition, and you can see actually in that poster there that you can identify the 3 out of 20 patients that have this disease very simply. This is a technology for imaging the mechanical properties of tissue. It turns out that this disease changes the stiffness of the liver tissue very early. It's been used at the Mayo Clinic since 2007, and it's essentially replaced biopsy. So for many patients, this technology offers a more comfortable, safer, more accurate, and less expensive alternative to an invasive biopsy. The goals of our company are to make this technology available not just to Mayo Clinic patients, but to patients around the world. The second goal is to do more research and development to push the technology forward. We think it's got a tremendous future. And then, of course, the third goal is to be financially successful and contribute to our local economy. We operate on a lean staffing model. We don't have any full-time employees. All of our employees are part-time on contract. Our research and development program is done at Mayo Clinic by my research program under contract to the company. Our manufacturing is conducted locally here through a contract manufacturer. And we don't need a sales force because we have really worked with the MRI companies, Siemens, GE, and soon Philips, to be our sales force. So that's our model. Our company is doing well. Our product is now in use in more than 100 medical centers around the world. We're on track in this first year now for $3 million in sales in the first year. And within a few years, our aim is to increase that by a factor of 10. And we think it's reasonable. Our pre-tax margin this year is 35%. So this is just our first product, and we have many other products in the pipeline. The strategy that we have is to focus on unmet clinical needs. And we have a tremendous advantage being at the Mayo Clinic because we know what those problems are. We also can apply these solutions to those problems and show that they work within the Mayo Clinic environment. And so the next product that we'll have based on this technology is probably going to be a brain imaging application that's now just entering clinical use at the Mayo Clinic. So that's just some background on Resounded, and I think I've used up my 3 minutes.
So good evening, my name is Jeremy Freese. I too am a radiologist. I've got a theme here. So I'd like to start by saying that this is an entrepreneurial zone. So this is a no-tie zone. So the next session we can all come on time. So I have the great pleasure of representing Evidential Health. And I don't see either of my 2 Mayo co-founders, Brad Erickson and Steve Langer, also radiologists and physicists, that have helped launch Evidential Health in conjunction with the University of Minnesota. And so we are a early stage health IT company that basically takes the electronic medical record and puts it on steroids. And so Tim talked about some of the problems that we see. One of the key problems that we see in medicine is it takes 17 years before information comes from science into true practice. And there are a lot of reasons for that. One of the things that we're trying to do with this technology is to get the science in such an easy, usable way at the point of care so that providers can make better decisions based on that information. And so we built a technology that is a combination of the Google search engine as well as a recommender system similar to what Amazon.com has. And combine that with some of the algorithms and clinical care pathways that we have at Mayo Clinic and embedded those directly within the EMR. So we built the technology and executed it at Mayo here in Rochester, currently in the process of executing it in the health system and in the other sites, which is a Cerner environment, or a GE environment here in Rochester, as well as at the University of Minnesota, who are also partners and founders in the company, which is an Epic environment. So with those three EMRs, anyone that's familiar with that landscape, that pretty much locks up 90+% of the potential hospitals that we could be selling this to. So right now we've built early stage of the technology and implemented and are just now kicking off commercialization phase. And so one of the things that I would pitch is we're very much looking for top sales and business development talent. And so we'll be eager to speak with anyone that's interested in a role similar to that. And so with that, I'll say thank you.
So I'll lead off with some questions, and I have actually got three questions, but I'll leave it for later, the other ones. But the first one relates again to perhaps something I mentioned in the description of our little company, and that is that I mentioned that we have this initial lean model for our staffing. And it seems to be working pretty well. But we've always assumed that at some fairly near point, we have to start moving into a more conventional staffing model. So that's the conventional wisdom. But I guess I'm going to ask you, are there examples where the runway is a lot further? Is it possible to have these startup companies to go quite a ways with that kind of model, or is it really inevitable that you have to go to a conventional staffing model very soon?
Well, I think it's, first of all, I don't think there's any hard and fast rule. I think the conventional wisdom would say, stay as lean as you can for as long as you can. But allow yourself to always sort of be checking what sort of business opportunity am I giving up by being as lean as I am. And sometimes there's impediments to growth that aren't just people, right? We like to think that our businesses are successful, so they can be super successful if I just had money to hire people, right? That's not necessarily the case. Adoption of any given technology is a hard thing to predict, but when you're running the company, and especially the feedback you're getting from your sales organizations, really should be taken very strongly, because therein lies the answer to your question. If the adoption and the rate at which you are able to bring in new customers is not growing exponentially, it's growing in a way that you can manage it with your current staffing, stay as lean as you can longer, because I've never seen a company go out of business because it had too much money. The overhead burden of creating an organization ahead of the capacity to support it is what sinks most companies. It gets you into a situation where you become unfundable and think the wheels really fall off. So always being, our bias is always being a little lean, but be sensitive to that sales lead. And if you get into a situation where you think you're very much under-supporting the true demand, that's when you need to take on additional capital to fund the growth.
Okay. So I think many of us would recognize that early stage capital is scarce, and there aren't too many VCs that invest very early on. And if you talk to the mid and later stage VCs, they have a pretty clear pretty clear bias or thinking about founders and founders' role within a company and founders' ongoing role within a company. So I'm curious from someone that's a really early stage investor, what are your thoughts? So recognizing we have two CEOs here that also have a day job, and we have, we've got a community of scientists. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on early stage founders' role in early stage companies and whether how that impacts your interest in investing.
Yeah, well, every company has a founder, right? So the reality is no two founders are alike. And so I think the question that you're getting at is not that. The question you're getting at is, can a part-time founder be active in running a company? And there, I think you can be active for a time. But there's going to become a time when the activity, if it's really of interest, more than what we call a lifestyle company. One of the things we struggle with the most is where we have university faculty who create companies that there's really, there's a tug of war. One side of it is pulled in saying, I want this to be a big company, I want it to be successful, I want all of those things. And then the other side says, I do not want to let go, I will not go without, and there's this tug of war that goes on between there. So that's normal. It's nothing that shouldn't be able to be managed. But the way I would think of it, and the guidance that we give to founders, is that if you really want your company to grow up, you need full-time management, full-time. And if you can take a sabbatical, or you can work out so that you can really be full-time, and I don't mean 5 days a week and on the dock on the weekends. That's not full-time. A startup requires 7-day-a-week commitment. And so if you can do that, then I think we have a reasonable history of having those kind of folks sort of grow the organization. We've, in the past, because of the way our model works, we've actually inserted ourselves in as a CEO while the founder takes care of business, whatever that means. And then 18 months later, they've been able to negotiate some stuff. They've also been able to stay involved in the company during those 18 months, but not as the CEO, but as an important person. And it gives them sort of a look to say, okay, now 18 months later, I feel even more committed to the company. It makes it easier for me to disengage with my previous day job and come over if that's appropriate. We've had other founders that after that 18 months, they have said, wow, now I see what you meant. Let's continue to grow the company. I would like to just be a board member, or I'd like to be a consultant to the company, or I'd like to be an advisor to the company. And so I would say that the main thrust is not that the founder needs to be removed. The main thrust is that the company needs full-time management. And so it's really up to the board of directors and the founder to work that out.
I enjoyed the talk and the comments by you guys. The question I'm asking is that how much time will it take for both of these companies to be bought by big companies for $1 billion? So what are we lacking in the quality, or what is the need that we are unable to create the quality of product so that they have not been purchased by Siemens and GE for $1 billion today?
Well, I think that's a difficult question to answer, right? But it sort of goes back to at what point have you demonstrated your model enough, right? There's no doubt that if you build a company that begins to take market share away from GE and Siemens, you impose yourself in a way that they lose their first sale. They come back. This is a GE place here, right? And so the minute that GE can't sell a new PET scanner or EMR or whatever their upgrade they're trying to sell, they can't sell that to Mayo because this little startup company just bumped them off, they'll pay $1 billion to take the company. Now, that assumes you're pretty mature and you're doing very well. So the question is, how can you repeat that experience but earlier on in the pipeline? And I really think it's a combination of things. It's a combination of having truly novel technology that can't be copied, so that they realize they can't design around it. I mean, I've seen GE be very clever in their abilities to try to design around it, but that just makes it, sort of imposes the need for the startup company to be even better. And you need some early successes where the technology really shows, either through peer-reviewed journals or podium presentations, where the eventual reality is cast, and it's just a matter of time. And when the organizations feel it's just a matter of time, then they'll step in early and they'll make those campaigns. And Jeff gave a very kind introduction for me tonight. He talked about a startup company that I was with that was sold for over $1 billion. And I can tell you that was a little different time. It was back in 1997. But the thrust of that was that we had embarked on a new way to treat cerebral aneurysms through a femoral artery approach. And we were not a big company. We had a couple hundred employees. We did not do a lot of sales. We had worldwide sales, but a total of only about $60 million a year, which, to pay $1.3 billion for would have not made sense. But what we taught, what we were teaching, was that this was a disruptive technology. It was going to play into the hands of a whole new type of physician, because at the time, interventional neuroradiologist was somebody that just did angiograms for the neurosurgeon. It wasn't really a caregiver who could bill at the same rate as the neurosurgeon. But these tools, it was clear that that was going to happen, which has happened. So I think it's a clarity of outcome and a little bit of gamesmanship in some ways to make them believe there's no way that IP portfolio can be reached.
In those circumstances you mentioned earlier in the presentation, where large pharmaceuticals and medtech companies had considered and in some cases actually done an early stage acquisition, they're necessarily taking on more risk with that acquisition. Are there some risks that they're more willing to assume than others, or does it really just depend on the circumstances?
That's a great question. I think that you can never rule out what I consider the people, the personal aspect of this. Because at the end of the day, when a company decides to buy another company, when a big company, let's say, wants to do a deal with a small company, it's someone in that organization that's sticking their neck out and is making that play, right? And that's a hard thing to quantify, exactly what it is that causes them to spiral in on a company early. But one of the things that we see that seems to be consistent with that is when the company's offering lines up with a strategic imperative that a company has. And those are hard to predict. They're easy to see once they happen, but they're hard to predict. Let me give you an example. There's an area now where we're starting to see some interest in, and GSK calls it electroceuticals. So not pharmaceuticals, but electroceuticals. And the way GSK thinks of that is they think of it in terms of, we understand the biology. Let's say it's inflammation. So they understand the biology. They understand the neuro pathway to that area of inflammation. They want to better understand the sequence of, let's just call it neuro excitement, right, for lack of a better term. Some combination of pulses, transmission down the axon or whatever. And then, if they can get that far, then they want to identify a device that can live within the confines, the man-machine interface, albeit to live in confines with the nerve bundles or in some way replicate that necessary therapeutic nerve pulse sequence. This has been an area that people have discussed for a while, and no one's really done anything. Some startup companies have come in, clearly pain management, with Pacer technology, is somewhat an example of success there. Medtronic has a product, tries to stimulate the sacral nerve for fecal incontinence. But again, these are more kind of shotgun approaches where they just try to sensitize a set of nerves in an area to try to get compensation in case for fecal incontinence of some kind of contraction. But what electroceuticals is trying to tease out is a more refined way to go after this. So I would say for years there's been thoughts about this. Some companies started, most of them failed. But it's very interesting. There's been a company that started that is now has investment. I think it's called SetPoint. It now has investment. It just did like its B round. It has investments from 3 strategics, and it may have a venture investor, but the primary money is coming through the strategics. And so there's no doubt in my mind that the reason why those strategics are interested is not necessarily because SetPoint has a better mousetrap. They clearly have a good mousetrap, but it's also consistent with more of a theme within the corporate world to try to understand this. And it is likely to be the best of class, the best of breed in this area, and their strategic imperatives are allowing them to gravitate to this new area. If this would have been, and as an example, Boston Scientific is part of that syndicate, if it would have been several years ago when drug-eluting stents were under fire, right? Remember 8 years ago, so 6 years ago, when the whole question came up about drug-eluting stents may be a bad actor in late thrombotic events. The whole witch hunt that subsequently resolved without, embolic complications. While that was going on, those companies were very much locked down, trying to figure out, that parameter. They didn't know what was going to happen, and so their ability to sort of migrate into what is more of a white space potentially for them is probably less. And so I think it's a unique intersection of their abilities and their interests, and then a company comes along and that happens very quickly.
Sure. Earlier, Timothy, you mentioned, you talked about adoption at one point. So I heard many people who are doing entrepreneurial work are developing a better mousetrap and one kind of another better way to diagnose a disease, a better way to treat a disease. Yet we know that medicine moves very, very slowly. You could even have fantastic literature evidence that something is better, and yet things move slowly at their own pace. What have you learned about the extent to which a little company can influence that pace? They've got a better mousetrap. To what extent they just have to sit there and wait until the system changes, or what have you learned about that?
I would say it's hard. It's hard, and that's why it's almost better to chart a whole new space, to go after something that is really, uniquely not well understood. I mean, if you remember, of the 3 companies that I showed that were, one of them was Ardion, right? Now, Ardion, for those of you that are unfamiliar with it, this is a company that really pioneered the early use of ablation technology to desensitize baroreceptors in the arterial spaces. Within the body, there's some unique spots, one of which is sort of in the base of the carotid artery, where if you press on those tissues, it completely changes blood pressure and changes it rapidly. And so Ardion doesn't go after the baroreceptors in the neck, but it's more, I think it's the kidney, the arteries that go through the kidney. And so this notion that you could treat the baroreceptors in a, quote, permanent way without doing other damage is still yet to be figured out. But because it had such a powerful potential, and they had some good clinical evidence, that company sold for an amazing number, and it's a milestone deal. It only gets more amazing if it works. But the reason why I put that up there was, and hope someone would ask the question, is there's some real benefit in pioneering an area. And even though the risks are higher, the benefit is so much more disproportionate that we tend, because of that, we tend not to do, well, the other side of the coin is incrementalism, right? And incrementalism, we think, is not a good option for venture-backed companies, because even if it's successful, the incremental value that's prescribed to it may not be significant enough to justify the investment. And so, optimally, probably there's a middle ground. Right? There's a middle ground that allows you to be pioneering in an area. In other words, think of something that you can do that can't be done any other way. But in fact, the therapy thesis is one that can be proven out. Proof of concepts can be robust, and that the likelihood of them being acquired, either in part or in whole, early on is better. And I think the other reason why I use those three examples instead of just showing all these kind of home run companies that just, one lump payment and they were done and the numbers were huge, is I think moving forward, I think that partnering, legitimate partnering, to allow the company to do things with a fidelity that's better than what they can do it on their own is a very smart strategy. It doesn't take away from any of the uniqueness of what you do. It doesn't take away from any of the need to come up with truly innovative, IP protectable activities. But what it does say is it says, there's different ways to finance it. And this notion that when you do your A round, you got paid more per share than you did when you did your C round, and when you did your B round, it's going to go up and C is going to go up. Well, I don't really believe in that, and we're not telling our entrepreneurs that. We're saying, let's look at funding scenarios that we can sort of diligence before we put that first dollar in, and that funding scenario may allow for a partnering with somebody. And if everything goes well, the numbers are still big. They're still very impressive. The returns are still excellent. The wealth creation is still worth, we think, worth the risks that we and the entrepreneurs take. But it's a different model. It's a model that actually is a bit risk-sharing, because you as an entrepreneur really don't have to be on the hook for raising all 5 of the rounds. If you can raise the first 2 and get a deal done, like they did with Ardeon, or any of those, or CardioMEMS, or any of those 3, that's an excellent return, and I think in some ways you improve the probability of success, because you're putting it into a world-class organization at the point where the organization really is world-class. I don't believe any of these big companies are world-class in developing ideas, but once they get a good idea, for them to go through the clinicals and the subsequent regulatory pathway, they are absolutely world-class. And so, again, it's sort of like a partnering, but it's a partnering at a point that makes the most sense.
Just curious, from your perspective, what's the biggest challenge facing the venture capitalist company?
I think the biggest challenge facing VCs is LPs, so the limited partners. So the biggest challenge for, let me tell you what the way our business works is, we're very good at, or anyone that's in our business who is a surviving VC for more than a few years is good at picking ideas, working with people, and helping companies grow and be successful. And that's what we do on a daily basis. What we don't do on a daily basis is raise money. So every 4 to 5 to 6 years, venture capitalists go out and raise money. And so, first of all, we don't do it on a daily basis, so we're not good at it. We're acceptable at it. Obviously, we've been able to raise 7 funds, so we know a little bit about it. But it's not what we do best. And the combination of the limited partner base is always shifting. It's always turning. It's a global economy, and our investors in our funds come from all over the world. And so every 4, 5, 6 years, it's unpredictable what it is that they want to invest in, or what what their syndication of folks who want to invest in. It's unclear if when we bring an LP in for Sanderling 7, whether that individual will even be an LP, will be working for a group that wants to invest in 4, 5, or 6 years. And so that's the biggest challenge, I think, for our business. And so we're doing things where we're building in-house capability. We're funding FTEs to help with that, to help with investor relations, to make sure that this outreach that needs to go all over the world is something that we, as managing directors, don't just show up every 5 years and try to dust the rust off and get to work. Because, like I said, I've never seen a company go out of business if there's money in the bank. I've never seen a VC go out of business when there's money in the bank either. So it kind of goes both ways.
There's a question on the
There's just one in the back. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just curious about your or your firm's opinion on the smart devices we have today, like the iPhone, iPad, all these similar things. How that's going to impact our care delivery to all the patients, and also the impact on the providers as well.
Yeah, I mean, I would say 5 years ago, people were looking to sort of move things onto we'll call it the handheld platform. And I think there's been certainly proliferation of application software in the same way that there's a proliferation of expert opinion on the internet. And so the real question is, how do you know? How do you know really what's going to matter? And I think that it's still too early to tell. I think that certainly the ability to communicate and to brand people on handheld devices for certain medical providers, I think is a real opportunity. And Mayo and others are pursuing that and trying to figure that out. I also think, albeit difficult to do, but as our internet society grows, our ability to control our own patient records and be really part of our care cycle, I think is a likely alternative in a way to drive, not necessarily drive down price of medical coverage in general, but to help alleviate sort of unwanted growth in the cost there. And so I think there is a likelihood that can happen. I mean, we certainly, this is a big area for us. Of the 3 areas that we invest in, one of the areas is what we call information health. And this is an area that we spend a lot of time on trying to figure out. And it certainly is sexy in its thoughts, but I think those that are going to be successful are going to be few in a very strategic way that they'll do that. Because in some ways, you need to cut through the noise that's out there. There's going to be, and there is even now, there's lots of medical opinion. I mean, WebMD today is not what WebMD was funded to be 10 years ago. They had much greater lofty goals for that. And those people were not, they were not unimpressive people. They were very impressive. The syndicates that funded that, the people, the ideas. But it's a tricky area. We, within our iHealth franchise, we started a company some time ago. It was called Stentor, and the idea was to first start with medical images and provide a very low bandwidth pipe to manipulate images, to store images, to look at images, to be able to sort of be the intel inside of all medical imaging protocols, and to morph into an expert system that was really more like an EMR, but it would have all these hooks on it. It would have a hook that would handle imaging, it would have a hook that would handle pathology, it would have a hook, and really build something extraordinary. But I can tell you, what we ended up doing was the success of the company early on was in image manipulation, and we were offered to sell the company to Philips, and we did, and that was great for everybody too. And now that embedded engine is really what all the eyesight products that Philips sells runs. But the reason why I use that as an example is it's hard. It's hard to get all those components in some sort of expert system that can be easily used by, our theory was both physicians and patients. And I think that as the evolution of the internet and the sophistication, hopefully, of the user will evolve as that pipe gets faster and more pliable, hopefully we'll be able to get to that point. Because, you know, albeit many people in our society are not active in their healthcare, probably, but probably should be. Those who are more active in their healthcare, I think, are more satisfied with the results. And so, you know, the way I view your question is, will we get to a point where internet savviness will allow patients to be a big part of their healthcare progression? I'm optimistic of that. Don't ask me, you know, to predict when that would happen, but I'm optimistic, and we as a firm are certainly looking at those opportunities. The last question.
You previously mentioned that a lot of the early any licensing or partnership with biotech, pharma, biotech, often are dependent on strategic imperatives. Is there any good way of finding out what different strategic imperatives are?
Yeah, it's very hard. It's really very hard.
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, the question was, if strategic imperatives are important in giving guidance to entrepreneurs to know what to give precedent to in their ideas, how can you get a better visibility on those strategic imperatives from big pharma or from big device players? And my answer was, it's very hard. All you can really deduce from these big companies is what they're currently doing. They purposely don't want their competitors to know what it is they're thinking about next. And so, you know, our take on this is, while it would be great to sort of know all that information, it's really very difficult to know it. But in your quest to look for things to get involved with, it still comes down to, are there really unique, novel, patent-protected opportunities that address large unmet clinical needs? And as cliche as that sounds, that's a pretty good guidepost to go down. And then as you start to do, if you can then answer that question, the first question on the presentation of, you know, what are my likely exits, or who might be my likely exit, or how can I achieve the exits? What do I need to do? Then that discussion will more tightly circle around the potential needs of an acquirer. And so that's a multi-step process. And oftentimes, you know, people just kind of blur over and they go, well, I'll deal with that later. And all I'm saying is, you want to deal with that early on. And the way to answer it is to sit down with a business development person from Medtronic, and so, or sit down with a business development person from GSK or Genentech or Boston Scientific, and because if you've got an idea and you've filed for the patents or you're thinking about it, just having discussions with them can oftentimes give you better guidance on their relative interest. And then the real punchline is, as you're starting to think about forming a syndicate, a funding syndicate, then you reach out to them at that time and you see what their appetite is. And if they realize that you're going to get funded, it's in a space that is a strategic imperative, they are not bashful at wanting to be part of that early stage investment. And this is different than it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, they would just say, you know, we're not really interested, you know, press on. But now they are interested in becoming involved early for a lot of these opportunities.
Great. Let's give a big thank you to